How do you respond to critiques that Christian Zionism is politically rather than theologically driven? So as we study the subject of Zionism and Christian Zionism, one of the charges that is often brought against us is that this is a political movement. And it is true, many people do see it like that. But to unpack this, we need to understand both Zionism and then also have an understanding of what is Christian Zionism. How is that different? Any student who studies the history of Zionism, the formation of the State of Israel, and the movement that pre-existed it, the Herzlian Zionism and the World Zionist Congress, you will inevitably soon discover that many people associated and involved with this movement were what have come to be known as Christian Zionists. So these were Gentile believers who, for some reason, were supporting the Jewish right to self-determination in their ancient homeland. Now, Zionism for Herzl was a political endeavor. He considered it as a way to help people escape anti-Semitism in the diaspora and that they needed their homeland. However, there was this other group of people who were instrumental in making some of this happen, and they had a slightly different belief. Yes, they wanted to help Jewish people escape persecution, but their belief was primarily founded in the Bible. These were what's known as Christian Zionism, and there were many of these people in the British cabinet around the time of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Let me just give you an understanding, a definition maybe, of Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is motivated by a biblically based religious conviction that sees a continuing need for the Jewish people and the covenants of God. Now, what it basically means is that we don't only see it as a political need, we actually see it as a biblical foundation. It is the fact that the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, were given that land as a covenant, and that they will come back into that land and they will then be redeemed and restored to their relationship with the Lord. There's many different nuances within the banner of Christian Zionism, but that is basically one of the ways that we find it here. The issue I'm highlighting this is that it's primarily actually, for Christian Zionists, a theological issue before it's a political issue. So the theology must always come first. The foundation of why our understanding of the Jewish people must come from the Scriptures. And then that plays out as we walk out our Christian faith, as we're using it to influence our worldview and the way we interact with the world. This, of course, leads to support in many different areas, including the political arena. And in the time just before the formation of the State of Israel, there were many British Christian Zionists and other Christian Zionists around the world who were helping and instrumental in organizing meetings and relationships with Theodor Herzl so that he could get the Zionist organization and this dream come to fruition. Now, when you study this history, one of the charges that is actually brought against it is that it's nothing to do with God. This is simply the modern Israel is a creation of the Zionist entity, and if it wasn't for all these people helping in their misguided understanding, then there would be no Israel today. But we've already gone through many of these restoration scriptures that talk about the return of the Jewish people to the land in unbelief. And there are many reasons why Christians should support Israel. You've got that foundational element that I've laid out there, the covenants, the promises, that God does not break his word, and that there still remains many unfulfilled prophecies relating to the nation of Israel. And we know that all of those prophecies that are related to the first coming and related to the nation of Israel in the past that have been fulfilled, they were fulfilled exactly as they were written. And because of that, we have a necessary consequence, a logical consequence, that we can believe all of the second coming passages will be fulfilled exactly as written. And we do not believe that they will be redefined, that they will be reinterpreted in some way through New Testament revelation to be fulfilled in a way that they didn't originally say. And this is part of the debate between people who believe in a future for Israel and people who don't. And this becomes very important when you're looking at the political aspects, because if you don't have a purpose for the nation of Israel today or in the future, then you are more inclined to lean to these harder views of supersessionism that end up being quite anti-Zionist, and as we've seen in some areas, that they stray over into the line into anti-Semitism. Now, Christian Zionism affirms a continuing belief in the covenants. The covenants, the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the New covenant, all of these are still in effect, and they have things that need to be fulfilled. What we need to do when we come to the biblical text is identify the passages that speak of a future Israel, and then we can fully understand Christian Zionism. It's not just politics, it is theology. One charge that is often brought against us is that This is something new. You wouldn't even be speaking about this before 1948. It's only because of Herzl's Zionist movement that we have Israel today, and therefore this is a new movement. It's connected to these new theological movements. We need to understand that this is not, in fact, true. Although the terminology Christian Zionism could be considered new by theological accounting in some ways, before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, there were still people that believed in a future restoration of Israel. They just did not call themselves Christian Zionists because they didn't know there was no such thing as a Zionist movement in the modern political sense. They were referred to as restorationists, and there were many of them, restorationists. They go all the way back into the early days of church history, and especially with the Puritan writers that just preceded the Victorian era and the evangelical revivals of that time, that when you had many of these restorationists taking high-profile positions in government, and they were able to influence and use their influence and title to help foster the establishment of the State of Israel. Let me read to you just one quote from the quintessential Prince of Preachers, Charles Spurgeon. He said, "We cannot help look for the restoration of the scattered Israelites to the land which God has given them by a covenant." And I quote from him here not only because he's a well-respected preacher, but because he was writing that in 1887. So this is long before 1948, the Zionist establishment of Israel, as we would say there. He was writing this simply long before any of this because he saw it in the Bible. He read the scriptures and he saw, yes, there's a regathering promised to the children of Israel, and we need to make sure that we pay attention for that. So I would say if people are trying to say this is just a political thing, we need to undergird it with theology. We need to show that the history of this belief completely predates the modern political movement. And the way that I often do this is to provide a biblical theology for the beliefs of Christian Zionism. Primarily, I'm referring to that belief that there's a purpose for the modern state today, even whilst they're in unbelief, that there will be a future national salvation that leads us into the kingdom era. These are some of the primary issues that we have today. The threefold way I like to teach this biblically is that we say it's like a stool with three legs. And the first leg is we have to prove that these are covenantally rooted. The promises of God are covenantally rooted. It's just a key fact that we need to keep coming back to. We find these laid to Abraham in Genesis 12 and expanded throughout the book of Genesis. And we find these things given to David in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. And we find these in the new covenant in Jeremiah 31. All of these things, in many ways, are related to the future promises of Israel. And it goes throughout the whole Bible, as we've already spoken about. When you come to the New Testament, you find in Luke chapter 1 the birth of Jesus Christ being associated with the Davidic covenant. When we talk about the death of Christ, that is with the new covenant. So all of these things are still in effect. Now, many people come to the book of Hebrews. This is one question that supersessionists often ask. They come to the book of Hebrews, usually Hebrews chapter 8, where the author of Hebrews is making that comment where he says that the old is becoming obsolete, and the new is now the one that we need to focus on. Whatever is becoming obsolete or whatever is becoming old needs to be done away with. And this is an area I like to call covenant confusion. So many people read a text like that and they say, you see, all of this Old Testament focus on a physical land, a physical nation, and a physical people, that has actually been done away with now, you see. And now we're in the New Testament era, and this is speaking about a spiritual fulfillment in the church. And if you're not careful, understand what's going on there, it can sound like quite a convincing argument because the text of Hebrews does say quite strongly that the old is becoming obsolete. But what has actually happened there is a mistaking of the covenant. If you read the book of Hebrews carefully, you'll soon discover that he is specifically speaking about the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant that is fulfilled and terminated with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He's not speaking about the promises found in the Abrahamic covenant or the Davidic covenant or even the new covenant in that respect, which continually affirm and repeat all of the covenantal promises first made to Israel. So we would agree in some sense that the Mosaic covenant has been done away with or fulfilled in the death of Christ. But that's a very different thing than saying that all of the other promises made to Israel are also done away with. What they do is they just take this term old and they put everything in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, under that term, and then they say, Hebrews says it's obsolete. But of course, that's not actually how the Bible works. The covenants are differentiated from each other. That's just referring to the Mosaic. So that argument's one I encounter quite frequently, and we need to push back against that there. He's doing away with the Mosaic. He's not speaking about the covenantal land promises that we find. So when we're speaking about this first foundation, covenantally rooted, show that the promises of a future Israel are related to all of the covenants. If you read carefully, when Paul is making his argument for a future Israel, and he says, so all Israel will be saved, and then he quotes two scriptures in support of his argument, and he quotes, interestingly, Isaiah 59 and Jeremiah 31. And those are the exact two scriptures in the Old Testament that speak about the new covenant. So what he's actually doing, it's a masterstroke of Pauline exegesis here. What he's actually doing is rooting his belief in the future salvation of Israel in the new covenant. Because people make all sorts of arguments that the old covenant's done away with, even the Abrahamic one is done away with. No Christian, whatever your belief in Israel, makes an argument that the new covenant is done away with. Because how can we? The new covenant is how we're grafted into salvation. It's the blood of Christ. Every time we take communion, we remember the new covenant. So for Paul to make that specific argument that the salvation of Israel is connected to the new covenant, and the new covenant is still in effect, and everyone agrees on that, then surely the conclusion of that is the salvation of Israel is a sure thing too. So the covenants are so important to grounding our theology. And the second stool, on the second leg in that stool, would be these things are prophetically confirmed. So they're covenantally rooted and they are prophetically confirmed. And what I mean by that is that the initial promises that you find in the covenants are then expanded and reaffirmed throughout the whole of the Bible. Particularly referring to the major and minor prophets of the Old Testament, almost every single one of them you will find prophecies speaking to this future time period, the future salvation and restoration of Israel. Isaiah chapter 2, Micah 4, Isaiah 60, all of these passages speak of this future time. So it's actually one of the most talked about periods in the whole history of the Bible, maybe even more than the time that Jesus walked on this earth for the years that he was ministering. We have so much in the prophets, so you can't discount them. So that's the second stool, covenantally rooted, prophetically confirmed, and then the third leg is they are eschatologically fulfilled. And what I mean by this is that they are then traced through into the New Testament. As I've already mentioned, the birth narratives, Luke chapter 1 connects all these things to the Davidic covenant. Paul connects these things to the new covenant. When you read through into the book of Revelation, you'll see these things connected to all the covenants. The tribes of Israel are still there. They're still significant. The covenants still stand. So when we're talking about Christian Zionism, or if you don't want to use that term, that's fine. We're talking about Christians who have a belief in the covenant purposes and future of Israel. All you need to do is have those three things. Show that these are rooted in the covenants, show that they are prophetically confirmed throughout the Bible, and that even in the New Testament, which is much smaller and admittedly doesn't address these things in the same way, it still affirms and repeats them at various places, which is extremely significant. So in answer to the charge, is this a political issue? No, it's purely a theological issue. So why is it that many Christians seem so active in the political arena? This is also something we need to do with wisdom, because there may be Christians out there who hold a simplistic view that we are told to just support Israel in anything and everything. I don't know anyone who actually makes that claim, but it's a charge that's often brought against us. And I think the answer, just if you're using wisdom, is to simply say, of course, that's not what we're claiming. We must uphold our Christian values and all these things, but one of those Christian values is, like the Apostle Paul said, we're not to be wise in our own estimation against the branches. We're not to boast against the branches, so we have to incorporate them into our theology and our politics.